The yellow school bus pulled up to Lincoln High School with its usual morning screech of brakes. Students poured out like water from a broken dam, chattering and laughing as they headed toward the imposing brick building. Among them, a 17-year-old boy named David stepped down carefully, his worn backpack slung over one shoulder. David looked around at his new school with quiet eyes. This was his third school in 4 years, thanks to his dad's military transfers. He'd gotten used to being the new kid, but it never got easier. The other students rushed past him without a second glance, already deep in conversations about weekend parties and upcoming tests. He walked through the front doors and immediately felt the familiar weight of being an outsider. Groups of students, clustered around lockers, their voices mixing into a constant hum of teenage energy. David pulled out a crumpled piece of paper with his locker number and started searching. The hallways of Lincoln High were typical of any American high school. Faded motivational posters hung on beige walls, and the smell of cleaning supplies mixed with teenage cologne lingered in the air. David found his locker after a few wrong turns and fumbled with the combination lock. "First day?" asked a friendly voice behind him. David turned to see a girl with curly red hair and genuine smile. She wore a student council pin on her sweater. "Yeah," David replied softly. "Just transferred from Georgia." "I'm Kelly," she said, extending her hand. "Welcome to Lincoln. It's not the worst place in the world, I promise." David shook her hand, briefly. "David, thanks." Kelly seemed to pick up on his reserved nature and didn't push for more conversation. "Well, if you need anything, just ask around for me. Most people know where to find the student council members." As Kelly walked away, David felt a small spark of hope. Maybe this school would be different. Maybe he could actually make some friends this time. His first class was American history with Mr. Patterson, a middle-aged teacher with thick glasses and an obvious passion for the Civil War. David slipped into a seat near the back and pulled out his notebook. He'd always been a good student, partly because books were easier to understand than people. "We have a new student joining us today," Mr. Patterson announced, looking directly at David. "Would you like to introduce yourself?" David felt every pair of eyes in the classroom turned toward him. His throat tightened slightly, but he managed to speak clearly. "I'm David. My family just moved here from Fort Benning in Georgia." "Military family?" Mr. Patterson asked with interest. "Yes, sir. My dad's in the Army." A few students nodded with what seemed like respect, but David noticed a group near the front exchanging looks he couldn't quite read. One of them, a tall blonde boy with the build of a football player, whispered something to his friends that made them snicker. The rest of the class passed without incident. David took detailed notes and answered when called upon, showing he'd covered most of the material at his previous school. When the bell rang, he gathered his things quickly and headed for the door. "Hey, new guy," called the blonde boy from earlier. "David, right?" David paused in the doorway. "Yeah?" "I'm Troy. This is Ben and Alex." He gestured to his two friends, both athletic-looking and wearing Letterman jackets. "We were wondering if you play any sports. You look like you might be fast." The comment felt loaded somehow, though David couldn't put his finger on why. "Not really into team sports," he replied honestly. Troy's smile didn't reach his eyes. "That's too bad. Team sports build character, you know? Help you learn to stand up for yourself." David felt an uncomfortable tension in the air, but decided not to read too much into it. "I'll keep that in mind," he said, and continued toward his next class. The morning continued with similar interactions. Most students ignored him completely, which David actually preferred. A few teachers made encouraging comments about his academic performance, but he kept noticing Troy and his friends watching him from across the cafeteria during lunch. David ate alone, which wasn't unusual for him. He'd brought a sandwich from home and found a quiet table near the windows. While he ate, he observed the social dynamics playing out around him. The cafeteria was divided into invisible territories. Athletes sat together near the center, theater kids clustered by the stage area, and various other groups claimed their own spaces. "Mind if I sit?" Kelly appeared beside his table with a lunch tray. "Sure," David said, grateful for the company. "How's your first day going?" she asked, settling into the chair across from him. "Fine. Everyone seems nice enough." Kelly followed his gaze across the cafeteria to where Troy was holding court with his friends. "Word of advice? Troy Hendricks thinks he runs this place. He's not a bad guy exactly, but he's got some strong opinions about how things should work around here." "What kind of opinions?" "Let's just say he believes in old-fashioned ideas about strength and respect. His dad owns half the businesses in town, so Troy's used to getting his way." David nodded thoughtfully. He'd encountered guys like Troy before at other schools. Usually, if you kept your head down and didn't cause trouble, they left you alone. After lunch, David had PE class, which he'd been dreading. He changed into his gym clothes in the locker room, trying to be invisible among the other boys. His body was lean but obviously strong, though he didn't broadcast it. Coach Williams, a former college football player, had them running laps around the gymnasium. David kept a steady pace, not trying to show off, but not lagging behind either. He'd been running since he was old enough to keep up with his dad's morning jogs. "Not bad for a skinny kid," Ben commented as they finished their third lap together. David didn't respond, focusing on his breathing and form. "You know," Alex chimed in from David's other side. "You're pretty quiet. Is that a Georgia thing, or are you just shy?" "Just prefer listening to talking," David replied evenly. Troy caught up to them as they started their fourth lap. "That's interesting," he said, slightly out of breath. "Most people our age have plenty to say about everything. You sure you're not just scared of saying the wrong thing?" David glanced at Troy but didn't take the bait. "Not scared, just careful." "Careful," Troy repeated, like he was testing how the word tasted. "Yeah, I guess that makes sense. New place, don't want to make enemies right away." The conversation died as Coach Williams called for them to start their cool-down stretches. David was relieved when the class ended, and he could escape to his final period of the day. As the school day wound down, David reflected on his first day at Lincoln High. It hadn't been terrible, but there were warning signs he recognized from experience. Troy's group seemed to be sizing him up, trying to figure out where he fit in their social hierarchy. David gathered his books from his locker and headed for the bus. Tomorrow would bring another day of careful navigation through the complex social waters of high school. He just hoped he could make it through his senior year without any major problems. The bus ride home was quiet, giving David time to think about his dad's advice from that morning. "Keep your head up, son, but don't go looking for trouble. Sometimes, the strongest thing you can do is walk away." David smiled slightly, remembering his father's words. If only it were always that simple. 3 weeks had passed since David's first day at Lincoln High, and he'd settled into a comfortable routine. He kept to himself mostly, which seemed to work fine for everyone involved. His grades were solid, and a few teachers had already started recognizing his potential. But Troy Hendricks hadn't forgotten about the quiet new student. It started small, the way these things always do. A shoulder bump in the hallway that was just hard enough to send David's book scattering. An accidental spill of chocolate milk near David's lunch table that forced him to move. Comments that walked the fine line between joking and mean. "Hey, David," Troy called out during chemistry class. "You're pretty good at this stuff. Mind helping me with this equation?" David looked up from his own work to find Troy standing beside his lab table with Ben and Alex flanking him. The teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, was helping another group across the room. "Sure," David said quietly, setting down his pencil. Troy slid his worksheet over, and David could immediately see that the work was deliberately wrong. Not just incorrect, but obviously sabotaged to look like the work of someone who had no clue what they were doing. "This isn't right," David said, looking up at Troy. "What do you mean?" Troy asked, with mock confusion. "I worked really hard on that. The molecular structure you drew here doesn't exist in nature, and this calculation is off by about 3 decimal places." Ben snickered. "Maybe Troy's just not as smart as you, David. Not everyone can be a genius." David felt the trap closing around him. If he helped Troy cheat, he'd be compromising his own integrity. If he refused, he'd be painted as unhelpful or stuck up. "I can," Show you how to work through it step by step, David offered diplomatically, but you'll need to do the actual work. Troy's expression hardened slightly. That's not very friendly of you. Here I am, asking for help, and you're making conditions. I'm not making conditions. I'm offering to teach you. Same thing, Alex said with a shrug. Either you help or you don't. Mrs. Rodriguez looked up from across the room. Is everything okay over there, boys? Just fine, Troy called back with a bright smile. David was helping me understand some concepts. After she turned away, Troy leaned closer to David. You know what I think? I think you believe you're better than the rest of us. Smarter. More disciplined. David met Troy's eyes steadily. I don't think I'm better than anyone. But you act like it. Always sitting alone, never joining in conversations, acting like you're above all the normal high school stuff. I'm just quiet by nature. Or maybe, Ben added, you think we're all too stupid to be worth your time. David could feel other students starting to pay attention to their conversation. This was exactly the kind of situation he'd been hoping to avoid. That's not true, David said calmly. I just prefer small groups to large ones. Troy straightened up and crossed his arms. Prove it then. Come hang out with us after school today. We're going to Miller's Creek to swim and just relax. The invitation sounded innocent enough, but David could hear the challenge underneath it. This wasn't really an invitation. It was a test. I appreciate the offer, but I have plans already, David replied. What kind of plans? Alex pressed. David hesitated. The truth was that he planned to go home and train in his family's garage, working on the heavy bag and practicing forms. But explaining that would raise questions he wasn't ready to answer. Just family stuff, he said finally. Troy nodded slowly as if David had confirmed something he'd suspected. Family stuff, right. Well, maybe another time. But David could tell from Troy's tone that there wouldn't be another invitation. The rest of the class passed in uncomfortable silence. David finished his work efficiently and submitted it without looking in Troy's direction. When the bell rang, he gathered his materials quickly and headed for the door. David, Mrs. Rodriguez called out as he passed her desk. Could you stay behind for a moment? David's stomach dropped, but he nodded and waited while the other students filed out. I couldn't help but notice some tension between you and Mr. Hendricks, she said once they were alone. Is everything all right? David considered his words carefully. We're just getting to know each other. Different personalities. Mrs. Rodriguez studied his face. She was young for a teacher, probably only in her late 20s, and David got the impression she saw more than she let on. David, I want you to know that my classroom is a safe space for all students. If anyone is making you uncomfortable or pressuring you in any way, I want to hear about it. I appreciate that, Mrs. Rodriguez, really, but everything's fine. She didn't look entirely convinced, but she nodded. All right, but my door is always open if you need to talk. David thanked her and headed to his next class, but his mind was already racing ahead to what might come next. He'd been through this, dance before at other schools. The testing phase where the established social order probed for weaknesses. Usually, if you could weather the initial pressure without backing down or escalating, people would eventually lose interest and move on to easier targets. But Troy Hendricks didn't seem like the type to lose interest easily. During lunch, David noticed that Kelly wasn't at her usual table with the student council members. He ate alone again, keeping his head down and trying not to attract attention. But he could feel eyes on him from Troy's table across the cafeteria. When he looked up, Troy raised his milk carton in a mock toast and smiled. The gesture looked friendly enough to any casual observer, but David could read the message clearly. This isn't over. The afternoon brought more subtle provocations. A foot extended into the aisle as David walked to his seat in English class, forcing him to step carefully around it. Comments just loud enough for him to hear about stuck-up transfer students and people who think they're too good for everyone else. David ignored it all, but he could feel the pressure building like steam in a kettle. Other students were starting to notice the dynamic between him and Troy's group. Some seemed sympathetic, but most appeared content to stay out of it entirely. After school, David walked to his bus with measured steps, resisting the urge to look over his shoulder. He could hear Troy and his friends behind him, their voices carrying easily in the afternoon air. Some people just don't know how to be social, Ben was saying. It's like they're afraid of making real connections. Maybe he's just shy, Alex replied, but his tone suggested he didn't really believe it. Shy is one thing, Troy said. But there's a difference between shy and stuck up, and there's a difference between being cautious and being scared. David climbed onto his bus and found a seat near the middle. Through the window, he could see Troy watching him with that same calculating expression he'd worn in chemistry class. As the bus pulled away from school, David allowed himself to relax slightly. But he knew this was just the beginning. Troy had made his position clear. David was either going to fall in line with the established social order, or he was going to be pushed until he broke. The question was, how far would Troy be willing to push? David stared out the window at the passing suburban landscape and thought about his father's training sessions. All those hours spent learning discipline, control, and the importance of choosing your battles wisely. His dad had always emphasized that the strongest fighters were those who knew when not to fight. But David was also starting to understand that sometimes, no matter how much you wanted to avoid conflict, it came looking for you anyway. The bus stopped at David's corner, and he gathered his backpack. Tomorrow would bring another day of careful navigation, another day of trying to find the balance between standing up for himself and not escalating a situation that was already teetering on the edge. As he walked toward his house, David made a mental note to spend extra time on the heavy bag that evening. Something told him he was going to need every bit of his training before this situation was resolved. The harassment escalated gradually over the next 2 weeks, like water slowly coming to a boil. David found his locker mysteriously jammed 3 mornings in a row, forcing him to be late to first period. His lunch table became a target for accidental spills and bumps that made eating there increasingly unpleasant. Troy had perfected the art of public humiliation disguised as friendly teasing. David. Troy's voice rang out across the hallway as David tried to make his way to third period. Wait up, buddy. David slowed his pace reluctantly. He'd learned that ignoring Troy completely only made things worse, drawing more attention and giving Troy an excuse to be more aggressive. We missed you at the game Friday night, Troy said, falling into step beside David. Ben and Alex flanked them immediately, creating a small moving crowd that other students had to navigate around. I don't really follow football, David replied, quietly. That's the problem right there, Ben chimed in. How are you supposed to understand what Lincoln High is about if you don't support the team? School spirit is important, Alex added. It shows you care about being part of the community. David could see where this was heading. I'm sure you guys played well. We won, Troy said with pride. 35-14. I had 2 touchdowns and Ben had 1. The whole town was there cheering us on. That's great, David said, meaning it. He genuinely didn't have any problem with their athletic success. The thing is, Troy continued, stopping abruptly in the middle of the hallway. When new people come to a school, they usually make an effort to fit in, to show they want to be part of things. David stopped too, aware that other students were starting to stare. I've been trying to fit in. Have you? Troy asked, tilting his head. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you think you're too good for all of us. Too good for our games, our conversations, our traditions. That's not true. Then, prove it, Ben said. Come to the party this Saturday. Rachel Morrison's parents are out of town and half the school's going to be there. David felt trapped again. The invitation was clearly another test, but this time there were witnesses. If he declined publicly, Troy would have more ammunition to use against him. I'll think about it, David said carefully. Troy's smile was sharp. You'll think about it. Right. He stepped closer, lowering his voice so only David could hear. You know what I think? I think you're scared of being around normal teenagers. I think you're more comfortable hiding in your books and pretending to be superior. David met Troy's eyes steadily. I'm not scared of anything. No? Troy's voice carried clearly now, drawing more attention from passing students. Then why won't you just say yes to hanging out with us? What's so hard about being social? The hallway had grown quieter as more students slowed to watch the confrontation. David realized he was being backed into a corner in front of half his classmates. Fine, he said finally. I'll be there. Troy's smile widened, but it didn't look like victory. It looked like a predator that had successfully cornered its prey. Excellent, Troy said, clapping David on the shoulder hard enough to make him take a step forward. It's going to be a great time. Very educational. The warning bell rang and students began hurrying to their classrooms. David escaped to his next class, but he could feel the weight of what he'd just agreed to. That evening, David found himself in the garage behind his house, working out his frustration on the heavy bag his father had installed. The rhythmic impact of his fists against the leather helped clear his mind and focus his thoughts. His father appeared in the doorway, still wearing his army uniform from the base. Rough day? Colonel Williams asked, watching his son's precise combinations. David caught the bag and turned toward his father. Just thinking through some things. Want to talk about it? David considered the offer. His father had always been someone he could trust with difficult situations, but this felt different somehow, more complicated. There's this guy at school, Troy. He's been testing me, seeing how far he can push. Colonel Williams nodded slowly. Testing is normal. New environment. Established social order. The question is, what kind of test do you think this is? What do you mean? Well, some tests are about finding your place in a group, others are about dominance, and some are about character. His father stepped into the garage and picked up a pair of hand wraps. Which one do you think this is? David thought about Troy's behavior over the past few weeks, the calculated escalation, the public challenges, the way he seemed to enjoy making David uncomfortable. Dominance, David said finally. Probably right. Colonel Williams handed him the wraps. So the question becomes, how do you respond to that kind of test without compromising who you are? I agreed to go to a party on Saturday. I think it was a mistake. His father was quiet for a moment, wrapping his own hands with practiced efficiency. Why do you think it was a mistake? Because I don't think Troy wants me there to have fun. I think he wants me there for some other reason. Such as David shrugged. To humiliate me somehow, to prove whatever point he's been trying to make. Colonel Williams stepped up to the heavy bag and threw a few light jabs. You know, son, sometimes the best way to handle a bully is to show up and be exactly who you are. Not who they want you to be, not who they expect you to be, but who you actually are. What if that's not enough? Then you deal with whatever comes next. His father landed a solid combination on the bag. But you deal with it as yourself, not as some version of yourself that's been bent out of shape by someone else's expectations. David nodded, understanding the deeper message. Stay true to my training. Stay true to everything we've taught. You. Discipline. Respect. Control. Colonel Williams stepped back from the bag. And remember, the strongest person in any room is usually the one who doesn't need to prove it. Saturday evening arrived faster than David would have liked. He dressed, simply in jeans and a plain t-shirt, not wanting to stand out any more than necessary. The Morrison house was in one of the nicer neighborhoods in town, and David could hear the party from 2 blocks away. Cars lined both sides of the street, and teenagers moved in small groups toward the house. David recognized some faces from school, but most of the attendees were strangers to him. He took a deep breath and walked toward the front door, reminding himself of his father's advice. Be who you are. Stay in control. Don't let anyone else dictate your actions. The front door was open, and music poured out into the night air. David stepped inside, and immediately felt overwhelmed by the noise and crowded space. Students filled every room he could see, talking loudly over the music and moving with the loose energy that came from being away from adult supervision. David, Kelly appeared beside him, looking genuinely surprised. I didn't expect to see you here. Troy invited me, David said, having to raise his voice to be heard. Kelly's expression changed slightly. Troy invited you? Before David could ask what she meant by that tone, a hand landed heavily on his shoulder. There he is. Troy's voice boomed even over the music. Our guest of honor. David turned to find Troy standing behind him with Ben and Alex, all three holding red plastic cups. Troy's eyes were bright with excitement, and David got the immediate impression that whatever Troy had planned for tonight was about to begin. Glad you could make it, Troy continued, steering David further into the house. We've got some people who are really excited to meet you. David allowed himself to be guided through the crowd, but every instinct his father had trained into him was suddenly on high alert. This felt wrong. The way Troy was moving, the way Ben and Alex were positioning themselves, the way other students were starting to notice their small group. Actually, David said, stopping in the middle of the living room, I think I should probably head home. Early morning tomorrow. Troy's grip on his shoulder tightened. Oh, come on, you just got here. Besides, we've got something special planned. David looked around the room and realized that more students were paying attention to them now. Some had their phones out as if they were expecting something worth recording. That's when David understood. This wasn't a party invitation. This was a setup, and he'd walked right into it. The realization hit David like a cold wave. The phones pointed in his direction, the expectant faces of his classmates, the way Troy's friends had positioned themselves around him. This wasn't just a party. This was a performance, and he was meant to be the main act. What exactly did you have planned? David asked quietly, his voice carrying despite the music. Troy's smile widened. Nothing crazy, just a little fun. See, some of the guys have been wondering about you. You know, where you come from, what you're really about. I've been pretty open about that, have you? Ben stepped closer, and David noticed that more students were gathering around them now, forming a loose circle. Because all we really know is that you keep to yourself and act like you're better than everyone else. David felt his training kick in automatically. Assess the situation, identify potential threats, plan multiple exit strategies, stay calm. I don't act like I'm better than anyone, David said evenly. Then prove it, Alex challenged. Show everyone here that you're just a regular guy who can have fun like the rest of us. What did you have in mind? Troy pulled out his phone and held it up. Simple challenge. Everyone knows you're smart, right? Always getting the best grades. Always knowing the right answers. David nodded cautiously. So here's the deal. We've got some questions for you. Easy stuff, really. But if you get one wrong, Troy shrugged. Well, let's just say there might be consequences. The crowd around them had grown larger, and David could see Kelly pushing through the group, her face tight with concern. Other students held up their phones, ready to record whatever was about to happen. What kind of consequences? David asked. Nothing serious, Troy said with false casualness. Maybe you have to do something embarrassing. Sing a song, dance, I don't know. Fun stuff. David could read between the lines easily. This was designed to humiliate him no matter what happened. If he participated, they'd find ways to make him look foolish. If he refused, they'd paint him as scared or stuck up. But there was a third option, one that his father had taught him about during their training sessions. Sometimes the best response to a rigged game was to change the rules entirely. All right, David said, surprising everyone, including himself. But I've got a counter-proposal. Troy's eyebrows went up. Oh, really? Yeah. Instead of your questions, how about we make this interesting for everyone? David gestured to the crowd around them. You ask me anything you want, but for every question I get right, you have to answer one of mine. The crowd murmured with interest. This wasn't what anyone had expected. Troy exchanged glances with his friends. What kind of questions? Fair questions. About you, about school, about whatever. David kept his voice steady and confident. Unless you're worried you might not know the answers. It was a calculated risk. David was betting that Troy's ego wouldn't let him back down from a challenge, especially not in front of half the school. Fine, Troy said after a moment. But when you lose, you still have to face the consequences. When you lose, David replied calmly. You leave me alone. For the rest of the school year. The crowd was fully engaged now, sensing real drama. Someone had turned down the music and students were pulling out their phones to record what was clearly going to be an epic confrontation. Troy considered the terms, and David could see him calculating the odds. Troy probably figured he could ask impossible questions while keeping his own answers simple. Deal, Troy said finally, extending his hand. David shook it, noting Troy's unnecessarily firm grip. You go first. Troy thought for a moment, clearly trying to come up with something difficult. All right, smart guy. What's the capital of Montana? Helena, David answered immediately. The crowd made appreciative noises. Troy's confidence flickered. Slightly. My turn, David said. What's the square root of 144? 12, Troy answered, looking relieved. Not bad. Your turn again. Troy's second question was harder. What year did the War of 1812 end? David paused, not because he didn't know the answer, but because he was starting to understand Troy's strategy. 1815. Lucky guess, Ben muttered. My turn, David said. Who wrote To Kill a Mockingbird? Troy hesitated. Mark Twain? Harper Lee, David corrected gently, and the crowd made disappointed sounds. Troy's face flushed slightly. Whatever. Literature's not my thing. That's fair, David said. We all have different strengths. But Troy was clearly frustrated now. His third question was designed to be impossible. What's the chemical formula for caffeine? David thought for a moment. He'd actually studied this in chemistry the year before. C8H10N4O2. The crowd erupted in impressed murmurs. Even Troy looked shocked. How did you? Troy started, then caught himself. My turn, David said. What's 15% of 80? Troy had to think about it, and David could see him working through the math in his head. 12, he said finally. Correct. By now, other students were starting to call out suggestions for questions, turning what had started as a setup into genuine entertainment. David noticed that the mood in the room had shifted. People were actually having fun, and Troy was starting to look less like a predator and more like just another student. But Troy wasn't done yet. For his fourth question, he went personal. All right, David, since you know so much about everything, tell us this. Why did you really transfer to Lincoln? What are you running away from? The room went quiet. David felt the weight of dozens of eyes on him, and he realized this was the real test. Not his academic knowledge, but his willingness to be vulnerable in front of his peers. David took a deep breath. My dad got transferred to the base here. We move every few years because of his job. I'm not running away from anything. I'm just trying to fit in somewhere new like anyone would. The honesty in his voice seemed to surprise the crowd. Several students nodded sympathetically, and David saw some of the hostility in the room evaporate. Fair enough, Troy said quietly, and David could tell that the answer had deflated some of his aggression. My turn, David said. Troy, why is it so important to you that I prove myself to everyone here? The question caught Troy off guard. He opened his mouth, then closed it, clearly not expecting to be asked something so direct. That's not... Troy struggled for a moment. Look, this school has certain standards, certain ways of doing things. When someone new comes in and acts like they don't need to follow those standards, what standards am I not following? David asked gently. Troy looked around the room, as if searching for support, but the crowd was waiting for his answer. You don't participate. You don't try to be part of things. I participate in class. I'm polite to everyone. I don't cause trouble. David kept his voice calm and reasonable. What else should I be doing? Troy was quiet for a long moment, and David could see him wrestling with something internal. The room was completely silent except for the background music. I don't know, Troy said finally, and his voice was smaller than before. I guess I thought you were judging us, looking down on us. David nodded slowly. I wasn't. I was just trying not to get in anyone's way. The confrontation that had started as a setup for humiliation had turned into something entirely different. An actual conversation between two teenagers, trying to figure out how to exist in the same space. Kelly appeared at David's elbow. "Maybe we should call this a draw," she suggested. Troy looked around the room at his classmates, many of whom were watching him with new interest. The whole dynamic had shifted, and David could see Troy realizing that his plan had backfired in the best possible way. "Yeah," Troy said after a moment. "Draw sounds good." But David could tell that something fundamental had changed between them. The test was over, and they'd both learned something unexpected about each other. The party continued around them, but the energy had completely shifted. Students who had gathered to watch a confrontation found themselves witnessing something more like a peace treaty. David and Troy stood in the center of the room, both looking slightly surprised by how the evening had unfolded. "So," Troy said, running a hand through his hair, "I guess I owe you an apology." "You don't owe me anything," David replied. "We just had different perspectives on things." Kelly stepped forward, clearly relieved that the tension had diffused. "Why don't we all grab some sodas and actually enjoy the party?" As the crowd began to disperse, Troy caught David's arm. "Can we talk for a minute privately?" David nodded, and Troy led him through the house to a quieter back porch. Ben and Alex started to follow, but Troy waved them off. "Just us," he said. Outside, the night air was cool and the music from inside was muffled enough that they could speak normally. Troy leaned against the porch railing and looked out at the backyard. "I've been thinking about what you said in there," Troy began, "about not judging us, and I realized something." David waited patiently. "I think I was the one doing the judging," Troy continued. "I saw you keeping to yourself, getting good grades, not trying to hang out with the popular crowd, and I assumed you thought you were better than us. Why would that bother you so much?" Troy was quiet for a moment. "Because maybe part of me wondered if you were right." The admission seemed to surprise Troy as much as it surprised David. "What do you mean?" David asked. "I mean, look at what I've been doing, picking on someone who never did anything to me, trying to make you look bad in front of everyone, setting up tonight like some kind of trap." Troy shook his head. "That's not exactly the behavior of someone who's confident in himself, is it?" David considered his words carefully. "I think everyone feels insecure sometimes. The question is what you do with those feelings." "Yeah, well, apparently what I do is turn into a jerk and try to make other people feel small." Troy looked directly at David. "I'm sorry. Really sorry. What I've been doing to you isn't okay." "I appreciate that," David said sincerely. "And for what it's worth, I never thought I was better than anyone. I was just trying to figure out how to fit in without making waves." Troy laughed, but not unkindly. "Mission accomplished on the not making waves part. You've been like a ghost for the past month." "That was the plan." "Why, though? I mean, you're clearly smart, you seem like a decent guy, you're in good shape. Why hide all that?" David thought about how to explain without revealing too much about his background. "Moving around a lot teaches you to be careful about making enemies. It's easier to keep your head down until you understand how things work. But that must get lonely." "Sometimes," David admitted. "But it's safer than picking the wrong fight with the wrong person." Troy studied David's face. "You talk like someone who knows about fighting." David felt a moment of caution, but something about Troy's genuine curiosity made him decide to share a little more. "My dad's military. He taught me that the best fighters are the ones who never have to fight. Because they're too scary to mess with? Because they're smart enough to find other solutions to problems." Troy nodded slowly. "Like what you did tonight. Instead of just answering my stupid questions or telling me to go to hell, you changed the whole game. I tried to find a solution that worked for everyone. Even me. Even though I was being a complete jerk to you." David shrugged. "Everyone deserves a chance to be better than their worst moment." They stood in comfortable silence for a few minutes, both processing the conversation. From inside the house, they could hear their classmates laughing and talking, the party continuing around them. "Can I ask you something?" Troy said finally. "Sure. When you were answering those questions in there, especially the hard ones, you weren't just showing off, were you? You actually knew that stuff." "Most of it, yeah." "That's impressive. I mean, I'm not stupid, but I couldn't have answered half of those questions. David looked at Troy with new understanding. Is that part of what bothered you? That I made academics look easy? Troy hesitated, then nodded. I work pretty hard just to keep my grades up enough to stay on the football team. Seeing someone who makes it look effortless, yeah, that stung a little. It's not effortless, David said. I study a lot, and I've always been good at taking tests. But that doesn't mean I'm naturally smarter than anyone else. Really? Really. Everyone has different strengths. You're obviously a good athlete and a natural leader. I'm good at memorizing information and staying calm under pressure. Neither one is better than the other. Troy seemed to consider this. I never thought about it that way. Think about tonight, David said. You organized this whole thing, got everyone's attention, controlled the room. Those are leadership skills that can't be taught. I use those skills to try to humiliate you, but you could use them for better things too. Troy was quiet for a moment. You know what's funny? I actually think we could have been friends if I hadn't been so determined to see you as a threat. We still could be, David said simply, even after everything I've done. Especially after tonight. It takes courage to admit when you're wrong and apologize. That tells me more about your character than the past few weeks did. Troy extended his hand. Friends? David shook it. Friends. They headed back inside together, and David immediately noticed the difference in how other students reacted to him. Instead of the wary curiosity he'd grown used to, he saw genuine interest and respect. Several classmates came up to talk to him, asking about his other schools and sharing their own stories. That was pretty cool what you did out there, said a girl named Ashley from his English class. The way you handled Troy's questions and then turned it around on him. Thanks, David said. I was just trying to make it fair for everyone. Well, it worked. You've got people talking about you in a whole different way now. As the evening wore on, David found himself genuinely enjoying the party. Without the underlying tension he'd felt earlier, he was able to relax and actually get to know some of his classmates. Troy made a point of including him in conversations and introducing him to people David hadn't met yet. Around 11 o'clock, David decided it was time to head home. He found Troy near the front door saying goodbye to other departing guests. Thanks for tonight, David said. This turned out better than I expected. Thanks for giving me a chance to be better than my worst moment, Troy replied, echoing David's earlier words. See you Monday? See you Monday. As David walked home, through the quiet suburban streets, he reflected on everything that had happened. His father's training had prepared him for many different scenarios, but tonight had required skills that went beyond physical techniques. It had required patience, wisdom, and the ability to see past someone's surface behavior to understand their underlying motivations. Most importantly, it had shown him that sometimes the best way to win a fight was to help your opponent realize they didn't actually want to be fighting in the first place. When David got home, he found his father reading in the living room. How was the party? Colonel Williams asked, looking up from his book. Educational, David said with a small smile. Good educational or bad educational? Definitely good. I think I might have made some actual friends tonight. His father nodded approvingly. Sometimes the best victories are the ones where everybody wins. David thought about Troy's genuine apology, about the way their classmates had responded to seeing them work through their conflict, about the conversations he'd had with students who had previously seemed completely uninterested in getting to know him. Yeah, David said. I think you're right about that. As he headed upstairs to bed, David felt something he hadn't experienced since arriving at Lincoln High. He felt like he belonged. Not because he'd proven himself in some dramatic confrontation, but because he'd stayed true to his values while helping someone else discover theirs. Monday morning would bring new challenges, but David was confident now that he could handle whatever came next. He'd learned that his father's lessons about strength and discipline extended far beyond physical training. They were about character, integrity, and the wisdom to know when to fight and when to find a better way. And sometimes, the better way led to unexpected friendships and a place where you could finally stop being invisible and start being yourself.